demand for fewer chemicals and more biological solutions is louder than ever, from consumers, regulators and producers alike. But who's turning that demand into reality? Enter Platform 10, a global network of farming organisations, researchers, entrepreneurs, investors reshaping the future of crop protection. In this dynamic global session, hear directly from Platform 10's Brains Trust as they reveal how they're fast-tracking breakthrough biopesticides, building grower confidence in novel pest controls and accelerating market adoption. Please join me in welcoming this stellar Brains Trust to the stage to talk all things budding, bold and breakthrough biologicals. Dr. Gina Cadby, Environment and Climate Director, Western Growers, Dr. Adrian Percy, Executive Director of NC Plant Sciences Initiative at the North Carolina State University, Dr. Louise Thatcher, Principal Research Scientist at CSIRO Food and Agriculture, and facilitator for the discussion, Peter Wren-Hilton, Founder and CEO, Wharf 42.
I hope you can hear me. I can now hear myself, so that's a good sign. So welcome to this session, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here and delighted to be joined on stage by such an awesome set of colleagues. So Platform 10 Biologicals, for those of you who don't know what Platform 10 is, it actually originated after the June 2023 Salinas Biological Summit, which Wharf 42 hosted with Western Growers. And what people said at that summit was they didn't want to wait 12 months until 2024 to discuss the same subject. And the reason for that was there is now an element of urgency around the removal of hard chemical pesticides from growers and farmers' toolboxes, and the need to find alternative solutions, particularly to manage things like pests. And so Platform 10 was born. Currently, we are running field trials in California. And this is just a very brief introduction. So while you read that, I'll try and talk over that. But it recognized the fact that there are a number of crops, particularly in the kind of fresh produce area, which are susceptible to pests. And by removing those chemical pesticides, growers were saying, well, what alternatives do we have? The challenge we have is that we're not looking down 15, 20 years. If you talk to the European Union, they're looking at things like 2030 as being the time when their Green Deal kicks in. That's only 5 years away, when they will start removing significant numbers of chemical pesticides from the toolbox. And it's not just the regulators, it's also the retailers like Walmart and Tesco are saying the same thing. So if you're planning to export into, say, the European market in 2030, and you're still using certain pesticides, then you will no longer have a shelf space to sell those that produce to. So that's really the theme of what Platform 10 is. It's a set of global field trials where we're working with commercial farmers, commercial growers, to trial and test new emerging biopesticides to replace those chemicals. So that's really a bit of background as to what Platform 10 is and what we're here today. But the main feast is really going to be the comments and from my colleagues here. So I'm going to sit down for a moment, and the first thing I'm going to do is just ask Gina. Gina, could you just say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Peter. As Peter mentioned, my name is Gina Cadby. I am the Environment and Climate Director at Western Growers. Actually super humbled to be with these two today. I do think there should be a doctor with a capital D and then a doctor with a lowercase d, which is, I think, where I would sit in. Anyhow, so with Western Growers, and we are a grower association based in the US, and we represent family farmers that grow fresh produce, fruits and nuts, and about 50% of the fresh produce in the United States and about 50% of the organic produce grown in the United States. And currently, we represent folks who are based in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, although our growers kind of have obviously reach across North America with the produce that they provide, and also grow in multiple regions around the world. So we're very tuned into the global scale of this and the need for collaboration with other organizations and other nations. So thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you. And I should have said that if anybody intends to have a medical event at this conference, this is the time to do it, because we've got 3 doctors on the stage. Although I'm not necessarily sure we're all that medically qualified, but Louise, perhaps you can talk a little bit about, again, who you are and your role at SARO.
Certainly. So Louise Thatcher, I lead the microbial technologies team at CSIRO Agriculture and Food. This is a part of a broader group of researchers in the organisation. We work on the discovery, improvement and deployment of beneficial microbes, their fermentation extracts or natural products to be exploited in crop protection, plant health and sustainable agriculture. I've been fortunate in my career at CSIRO to work in Perth, Brisbane and now I'm based in Canberra and worked across pests and diseases of cereals, brassicas, legumes and cotton. So I have an appreciation of the challenges that our growers face in protecting their crops and maintaining profits. And I really see my role here as, how can our scientists be helping our growers maintain yields and profits and prepare them for what will be a chemically limited future.
Thanks very much, Louise. And finally, Adrian.
Yeah, hi everyone. So what we do at the Plant Sciences Initiative is try to leverage interdisciplinary science to the benefit of agriculture and the environment. And we're doing this really by bringing together the agronomists, the entomologists, plant pathologists, with engineers, with data scientists, and doing that oftentimes in partnerships with industry. And ideally, we're looking, to make impact on the farm down the road, and we do that through various mechanisms, through licensing out technology, or sometimes actually through creating small startups ourselves. In addition to that, I work on a number of boards, including some biological-based companies. My background is from industry, so I worked for Bayer, where I was CTO for a few years, and also at UPL, both crop protection companies. I actually got into biologicals 10 years ago when Bayer bought a company called AgroQuest, which was out in Davis, California. They paid $425 million for that biologicals company. So if you're in there as an entrepreneur, there is hope, and hopefully we'll see those kind of deals done in the future as well.
No, that's awesome, and we'll hopefully, as you say, talk a little bit about the future going forward. One of the key elements of Platform 10 is we want growers to be at the center of the conversation. All too often, they're not, and so that's something that we think is significant to secure adoption. And so the field trials that we will be hosting are on big commercial farm properties. And so just as an example, if, for instance, you're running a field trial with Driscoll's on strawberries, if Driscoll's say, look, this works for us, there's a very good chance that other strawberry growers will say, well, if it's good enough for Driscoll's, it's got to be good enough for us. And that way you encourage adoption rather than trying to sell it purely through what I call traditional commercial channels. And so my first question to Gina, bearing in mind your role with Western Growers, is just how important it is for you to have growers at the center of this conversation, and how is it best to engage with them?
Yeah, it's very important to us. So a bit of background, for Western Growers, we have what's called the Center for Innovation and Technology that's based in Salinas, California. We also call it the CIT. And one of the reasons why this is important is in terms of technology transfer. So say a grower comes to us and says, we're willing to try this new equipment or whatever it is, and they show up, and it turns out the equipment is too wide for the rows, and it doesn't fit. So the equipment company says, no problem, we'll just have you plant the rows wider apart, right? And obviously that doesn't work for the grower, so they come back to us and say, fix this. So that's one of the reasons why the CIT exists, is because how do we bridge the gap between technology and what is needed for actually having it be practical on farm. And so kind of putting that into biologicals, how do we help bridge the gap between theory and practice? And the other reason is, growers, when they want to transition, trying new things is risky. There's a lot of risk. So if you think about, for example, strawberries, the cost of production before a single strawberry is even picked is astronomical. So the incentive to transition means that you are also incorporating the idea of risk, and who takes on that risk, and what do you benefit from when you do take on that risk. So growers are the ones who are taking on a lot of that risk. Also, in terms of when we talk about biologicals, we often think, oh, this is going to compete with or replace traditional chemistries, and that's not necessarily the case because there are issues that exist that need solutions that don't have, that aren't there, right? So how do we find solutions to issues, problems that persist? And then with climate change, we anticipate more of those issues becoming more problematic or more unpredictable and needing to build that resilience. So how do we fit into that gap where we can use products to actually solve problems that currently don't have solutions?
Thank you, Gina. We'll come back later on to again, more grower engagement. But Louise, one of the things we did on Monday here in Brisbane is we hosted the Brisbane Biological Symposium, and it was hosted generously by Saro. And what was really interesting about that event was that on stage we didn't just have representatives from Saro, we had representatives from horse innovation here in Australia. From New Zealand, we had ag research, we had plant and food research, a lighter touch. And I think what that day generated was a real sense that science has still got a hugely important role to play as we look at the future of the development of ag inputs, both biologicals and also lighter chemistries. And so my question, I guess, to you, Louise, is how do you view the significant role that science can play, and particularly that opportunity for cross-border collaboration, leveraging, for instance, counter-seasons with the Northern Hemisphere, really to accelerate development in this area?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. So one of the key areas that we focus on within our research is listening to feedback from the growers, and some of the main constraints might be around cost of new products or maintaining reliability of products, and that's where we can really come in as scientists and answer these research questions and look at improving. So some of the work we tackle is reducing the cost by improving production. So that might be redesigning bioproduction systems, thinking of replacing what your traditional fermentation tank for a microbial product might be, and really rethinking that whole design so it's suited to the microbe and product at hand. And again, understanding how we can use science, understanding the genomics of these microbes to get them to do more of what we want them to do, make them more efficient. So they grow off cheaper materials, produce more of what we want. So I feel science can really drive that aspect. And then in terms of delivery on farm, science there can bring an understanding of how these biological products work, how we can improve their performance on farm, and how we can integrate them in integrated pest and disease management. And one of the things you raised around being able to interchange with chemistry or softer chemicals. And there's some real economic benefits to be gained from that in terms of, we talk about resistance management on farm. That's a major cost to growers and for ag chem companies if you lose a mode of action. So knowing how we can incorporate biologicals with traditional chemistries, I think that would be really powerful as well. And yeah, we can do that generating in data and then provide that data to industry and growers so they can make informed decisions on what products they use and when.
Thanks very much, Louise. Turning to you, Adrian, one of my, I guess, concerns, and one of the reasons I'm so engaged in this whole biological discussion is the urgency that is now applied or is being applied, particularly to growers. I always have a phrase which I've used, which is regulators bark, retailers bite. And what concerns me is not only the fact that regulators are now beginning to say, by 2028 or 2030 or 2032, we'll remove these chemicals from the growers' toolbox. But it's the retailers, it's the Walmarts and it's the Tesco's of the world saying, we'll do the same thing, but we might even do it 2 years earlier. And so if Australian or Kiwi growers are still using those pesticides, there's a very strong chance that you will not be exporting into those traditional markets. So my question to you, and again, just one kind of additional point to make there, is that in the past with chemicals, we've always said, well, the good news is Big Ag's got this huge pipeline of emerging products. sorry to say, my experience is there isn't that huge pipeline of new products in the pipeline. So we are looking at a really area where this level of research and science is absolutely critical. So just in terms of your views, Adrian, in terms of we don't have time to kick the can down the road, we need to start working now, and your view of that whole kind of regulatory retail environment.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say the time to act is now, but it was actually 5 years ago. But we are where we are. I think it's really important that we both embrace those biologicals which are already available, but also help to bring through the next generation of products, because it does take a time. Even though the R&D times for a new biological are considerably shorter than for a synthetic chemical, they still take time. And of course, you've got to factor in the R&D time, the regulatory review time, but then the grower adoption cycle as well, which can be longer for a biological because they are not chemistry, and they do sometimes need to be fitted in carefully with existing cropping systems. But going back to what you were saying and kind of reiterating, I think in terms of the availability of chemistry is clearly compromised. We've seen a lot of active ingredients disappear from the market over the last 5, 10, 20 years. In fact, whole classes of chemistry have disappeared. And that's because of regulatory action and the removal of organophosphates and other tools which were critical for controlling certain types of pests and diseases in the past. In terms of replacement, you're absolutely right. I feel that while the crop protection industry continues to labor and to work on discovery, the output of the pipelines from those companies has somewhat dried up, not completely, but somewhat. And that is reflective of a couple of things. It's reflective of the fact that we have fewer of those companies now doing basic R&D. There's been huge waves of consolidation in the industry. Within those companies, there's a lot of pressure on R&D expenditures. But it's also just harder to find new modes of action. These are not things that fall out of the tree. A new herbicide mode of action would be really something that would be wonderful given what we see the lack of herbicides in certain markets. You mentioned resistance. That has taken out other available chemistries because of the lack of alternatives, and so growers rely perhaps too heavily on some of those individual products. So there's a whole raft of reasons why we're not seeing the replacement. I think biologicals offer a great alternative, either on their own or in complementary kind of fashion to chemistry, but there are also other alternatives, and we see some of those at this conference. Laser application and electrocution of weeds. But some of these technologies, while very interesting, are quite limited in terms of what they can do. They don't necessarily go across multitude of crops or types of diseases or weeds or whatever. So I think biologicals is really one of our key tools moving forward, and we need to kind of really get behind this train and push it all forward.
Great comments there, Adrian. Going back, Gina, if I may, to growers, it's one thing having the product, the actual biological, but we also need to make sure that growers are educated into how to use those biologicals, because clearly the application may be quite different from traditional chemistry. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your work with Western growers, how you think growers can best be educated in terms of how to think about kind of that biological world, particularly where they're not currently using biologicals from an education and adoption perspective.
Yeah, great question. There's one of the barriers to adoption that we think about a lot is what I call user error. So not necessarily that they're using it incorrectly, but maybe communicating with product companies how to fit on farm is really critical, right? So if your product needs to be refrigerated, is there refrigeration throughout that whole transit chain and on the farm? If your product needs to be applied as a prophylactic, as opposed to identification and you want to see that knockdown, that's going to be a different so certainly there is grower education that needs to happen in terms of the expectations of what happens after you spray. If you're expecting it to act like a knockdown, but it's a prophylactic, how do you how do you re-educate on that? And then also, is it going to change based on, are you going to have to now spray based on, let me back up. So for example, with climate change, we do see more extreme weather events happening. And so in California in particular, we saw our first hurricane touched ground a couple years ago, and we had the perfect storm of conditions this past year for wildfire. And these once in 100-year events are now happening every year, every other year. So how do we readjust our expectations for what is an emergency use, or what is a, acting in advance of what you anticipate being a challenge, right? If you have that incoming hurricane, that's going to be humidity. That's going to impact certainly pest pressure. So how do we prepare growers for, I think, what's coming, what's to come in terms of climate change, and also these new products, how they actually function?
You've raised a number of great points there, Gina, and really just going over to you, Louise, talking again from that kind of science perspective. Two areas really just Gina's first has highlighted. First of all, the impact of climate change and the introduction of new invasive species, which growers are not necessarily familiar with, can be quite devastating if we don't have the right tools to address that. And going on to the whole cross-border question in terms of collaboration, I've yet to meet a thrip that stops at the French border before going into Spain or Germany. I mean, the reality is that growers around the world are suffering the same challenges. So from your perspective and kind of a Saro perspective, how do you view that cross-border collaboration and the opportunity it brings to accelerate the research that you're currently doing?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. Science is about collaboration. You can't do everything. No one's an expert in every discipline, certainly. And I think, biologicals have been around for a little while, and I think there's really, we can look at the success stories and where there have been failures along the way under these different climatic conditions, and really learn from that. And that comes through collaboration. So working closely with our New Zealand counterparts, with the US and Europe, and Saro really tries to allow these sort of interactions. So we've developed strong relationships now with the USDA and INRA and Rothamsted to really look at how we can share knowledge and progress this area.
I know some of the comments there have been a little bit negative, so I want to kind of make the thing a bit uplift, and I think Adrian's the perfect person to do that, because when we talk about challenge, we're also looking at opportunity, and I think there is a huge opportunity. When people ask me, just as a bit of personal background, I established Agritech New Zealand, and I've sat on the evokeAG and evokeAG steering committees from the kind of day one. Why have I focused so heavily on biologicals in the last 2 or 3 years? And it's because even though it might appear to be a relatively limited area, the actual addressable market is just so massive, and the impact of removing chemical pesticides from the grower's toolbox has huge implications in terms of food supply and food security. But it does create opportunity. I'm just interested, Adrian, when you look at the market, not just from your science perspective at North Carolina University, but with your big ag background, and I know that you're also involved in the venture industry, so you do invest in emerging companies. Where do you see the opportunities going forward?
Well, I'm sure there's more than I'm going to mention, but I can think of 3 kind of off the top of my head. I mean, one is, as you've kind of alluded to, opening up potentially new markets. You mentioned about secondary regulations coming from retailers, supermarket chains, the Whole Foods of the world, where there's an expectation of lower residues. And of course, biologicals, by their nature, will not generally deliver any residues. So there's an opportunity there to produce a crop that has less residues that may go into segments of the market that previously may have been difficult for growers that were using a lot of chemistry on their crops. So that's one area. I think another area in terms of the environment, I give one example. In the US, a product recently was registered, an RNAi-based product, on Colorado potato beetle. It's extremely, extremely precise and specific in knocking out these beetles, and it does not affect other beneficial insects in the field. Now, the previous use of chemistry in those crops did have broader environmental effects. So there's a clear benefit, I think, from the environment. But the other area, I think, is a whole category of new products, which is the biostimulants. And again, there's a lot of different categorization of biologicals, but products which can help with plant nutrition, can help with resiliency of the plant against stress, climate change events, too much heat, too much water, too much drought. This is really white space that we're moving into. There's not a lot of chemistry existing in that area, and there's a lot of companies here looking at those types of applications. Products which can enhance carbon sequestration is another area. So lots of opportunities in my view.
Yep, no, I agree. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the slide with me, but at our Salinas Summit, both in 23 and 24, we commissioned the Mixing Bowl, which is a kind of US ag marketing company, to come up with a landscape map of biologicals. And their initial discovery came up with like 1,400 companies around the world working in the biological area. And as Gina frequently reminds me, it's not the 1,400 companies, it's that each of those companies had probably a list of 5 or 6 products. So for growers, it's an absolutely overwhelming thing. So again, just going back, if I can very briefly, Gina, in terms of how you reach growers, because I mean they're busy anyway. These people are massively busy, and if they have a particular challenge and they're suddenly presented with this massive array of options, how do you think they kind of are best able to manage that to make actual decisions?
Yeah, I mean, that is the challenge, right? So growers are approached all the time with, this is going to increase your yield by 50%, and then when combined with this other product, it's going to increase your yield by another 50%, and don't you know it, you're going to have a 200% yield increase at the end of the day, and they're sold this all the time. And so how are you able to figure out what is actually effective, what is a good investment, what actually makes sense, so what's going to yield the benefits that you need on farm as opposed to what is a need to have versus a nice to have, right? So I think helping growers to understand the efficacy of these products, and I think Adrian brought up a really good point here, we tend to focus a lot on biopesticides when we talk about biologicals, and biostimulants tend to kind of get glossed over because, one of them, there's a clear economic impact due to damage that you can witness. And another one with biostimulants, you may or may not know whether or not that was actually effective, right? So maybe if you had not applied it, you would have had the same result at the end of the day. So it's really hard to say, but there is good opportunity to lean on those products in terms of building resilience, with extreme weather. And so how do we figure out what is the actual objective here? What do you consider success? So working with growers to understand what they need, and then helping them filter through all those products. And a lot of that is reducing the risk through showing efficacy. And so that's, I think, one of the benefits of why we're really interested in Platform 10 is, really understanding that efficacy question.
Perfect. And a great time to mention Platform 10. So when we hosted the symposium on Monday at SARA, we soft launched Platform 10 here in Australia. So this year, we're running our first set of major field trials in California. And the second place that we're looking to start those field trials is down here in Australia and New Zealand. And what that will do is that will give us a dual hemisphere, the counter-seasonal opportunity to run similar trials and compare results and really accelerate the whole R&D experience and the experience of commercial growers. So one of the things that we're looking for today are people in Australia and New Zealand who potentially want to partner with Platform 10, whether as growers, whether as biopesticide companies, whether as investors, really to begin to build the platform down in this part of the world so that growers have got the opportunity to really experience in real time what opportunities and options there are to replace those chemical pesticides. So we've got 1.5 minutes left. I really want to just ask whether there are any final comments that any of the panelists would like to make.
Maybe I can add a final comment. I think in this morning's sessions we heard a lot about soil health and soil carbon, and I think, talking about, Adrian, your comments, that there's a real opportunity here for biologicals in that area to improve soil health and diversity, and more broadly in the ecosystem, farming system, ecosystem as well. So there's some of the additional benefits of adopting a biological solution in your farming system.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that you made the point, there's a lot of biological companies out there. I think it's going to be so important for those that end up being the winners that they're going to be, showing true efficacy, consistency of effect, really doing what it says on the tin kind of thing. And I think the grower adoption part is going to be perhaps the most important. You know, are these compatible with either existing production systems, or can they be made adaptable? And of course, I think Platform 10 is one of those ways that we're going to see that happen.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Well, just before we finish, you may or may not find this particular brochure on your seat. Or if you might have been handed one on the way, and if not, please let me know, and I'll make sure you get one. This is just a short, brief document that tells you all about Platform 10 and how you can engage with it. So with that, I would like to thank the panel for your contributions today. Awesome work, and look forward to speaking to as many of you as possible in the remaining hours of this show. Thank you very much.